I love you.
What is going on, everybody? This is Mike Hughes, and you're listening to the Shy Kid and everything Chicago sports-related podcast. Chicago Cubs baseball is officially back, and I couldn't be more happy about it. Pitchers and catchers report today at Mesa, Arizona facilities. It's going to be a lot of fun to see what could potentially happen this spring training, this go-around. Obviously, there's so many new faces in the organization, and not just in this organization, but in the National League as a whole. You have Shohei Ohtani joining the list of the Los Angeles Dodgers, which is going to be a lot of fun. There's so many players still available in free agency. We're going to be talking about that and so much more. Obviously, the four Scott Boras clients, Blake Snell, Jordan Montgomery, CodyBellinger, and obviously Matt Chapman. A couple of those names will be potentially noted by the Chicago Cubs and still very much interested. I'm curious to see what happens, though. I'm curious to see what happens. Before we get into anything, let's talk a little bit about Cubs. Before we get into free agency, because free agency just feels like a headache more and more every single year, especially when you're dealing with the Scott Boras family. But with that being said, man, spring training is going to be a lot of fun. We already see guys like Nico Horner, Patrick Wisdom, Michael Busch, Dansby Swanson, and so many others already participating in practices, which obviously they don't have to for another week. We don't have an official date until, I believe, February 23rd when they tip off against the Chicago White Sox, which this go around I think is going to be very interesting because the Chicago White Sox look awful. But you know, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun, for a lack of a better word. I mean, there's no real other way around it. I think that is really my big word going into spring training this year is fun, exciting. You know, words like that, really breaking down Chicago Cubs baseball the best we can, but also understanding that, you know, we have a target on our back. We made a little bit of noise last year. Now, obviously, we're not as big of a target as the Los Angeles Dodgers or the Phillies or something like that, but teams definitely are starting to feel us, and I think that's one of the biggest things right now for me. If you're the Chicago Cubs, bringing in Craig Counsell, the Milwaukee Brewers definitely feel some type of way. You know, we understand that they are going to take every single game personally like it's the World Series because we took their skipper. So it's going to be a lot of fun, man. I think it is going to be one of the better Cub seasons we've had since obviously the departure of the core. This is going to be one of the biggest tests for this organization now that we've brought in guys like Shota Imanaga, a guy like Seiya Suzuki, a guy like Dansby Swanson, CodyBellinger, and so many other bigger names. It's going to be interesting, though, man. It's going to be interesting. Somebody said in the comments, Brewers couldn't care less about the Cubs. I disagree. I disagree. I feel like a lot of people feel a lot of different ways. Obviously, they went after Rhys Hoskins. They're trying to be competitive. They're trying to make some noise. Just trading Corbin Burns. You know, I think they're definitely going to be in one of those situations, you know, where we're all right. You know, this is crazy. This is crazy. You're always been our little sister, which is insane to me. We got a comment here from a Milwaukee Brewers fan talking about how the Chicago Cubs are the little brother, little sister to the Milwaukee Brewers. Coming from the organization that's never even won a World Series is absolutely crazy. So nonetheless, barely even ever wins the division. So, you know, it's crazy. It's that time of the year again. We can have real conversations. We can sit up here. We can bust each other's balls. We can talk real. But that is just absolute blasphemy. We've never been the little to anything. It's Wrigley North for a reason, brother. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be dope. It's going to be dope. It's going to be a good time. I'm really excited to see what could potentially happen for the Cubs this year. We're going to talk about, first and foremost, before we get into anything, pitchers and catchers report. So we're going to talk about the three pitchers that I think we should keep an eye on going around this year for the Chicago Cubs. I want to start off with Shota Imanaga. Shota Imanaga, obviously the biggest fish for the Chicago Cubs in free agency this year. One of the better pitchers in all of Japan, next to guys like Yamamoto and Shohei Ohtani. So it's going to be fun to see what the 30-year-old lefty could potentially do. I saw him working with Rick Sutcliffe just the other day, Chicago Cubs icon and legend, one of the best pitchers in Chicago Cubs history. It's going to be fun to see if he could potentially be a mentor to a guy like Shota, and if Shota could be a student of the game, which I believe he will be. We already know how he understands the history of the Cubs organization. He understands what it takes to win a championship. He won with Japan. He won with several organizations in Japan. It's going to be fun, though. I think this guy's going to be nasty. His splitter slider combo is going to be one of those things that I think is going to translate to the MLB very well. I think one of the only things I would say is, you want to frame it a little differently when you're in the MLB. It's a little high for me when you look at where he's going at the top of the shelf. I think that's one of those things where pitchers are going to be able to indicate that's a red flag, especially against a guy like a Mike Trout or a Ronald Acuna Jr. That's going to get eaten up. It's going to take it 450 deep to center. But it's going to be one of those things where I think it's going to take some time for this rookie to get acclimated. But I think Shota Imanaga is going to be one of the better pitchers in baseball from a rookie perspective. I think he's going to be one of those guys you have to have on the watch, potentially for Rookie of the Year. It's just my personal opinion. I know that's a little biased, but obviously guys like Yamamoto are there as well, so I'm not going to sit up here and act like, Shota is going to be clearing everybody, but I think he's definitely going to be in the race for it. I think there's a case he can make to say, okay, you have the lineup to back it up. If you bring in a guy like Cody Bellinger, see prospects continue to develop. I think the Cubs have a really good shot. I really do. It's going to be fun, though. It's going to be fun with Shota. I keep saying that. I keep saying it's going to be fun, but it really is. I'm just geeked about it. Number two, I want to talk about Ben Brown. Ben Brown's one of those guys that I think would have made the September roster, the September call-ups, if he didn't get injured earlier with the AAA Iowa Cubs. He's one of those guys that I believe is going to potentially crack the roster at some point in 2024. I just don't know if that's going to be through the bullpen or that's going to potentially be in a rotational spot, whether that's due to injuries or whether that's just due because they feel like he's next up. But with that being said, Ben's one of those guys that you need to look at and say, this guy is seriously going to be a huge part of this rotation in the future. You got him in the Dave Robertson trade back in 2022, and he's one of those guys that I feel like just doesn't get talked about enough. Ben's been absolutely phenomenal and super consistent. His stuff continues to get better every single day. I've gotten the pleasure of talking to him multiple times, both for the Iowa Cubs organization and obviously on the podcast. But, I think at the end of the day, what you want to see from Ben going into spring training is just him being fully healthy, him being 100%, being the best version of himself and somebody that could really just go out there and eat innings, because that's really one of the biggest question marks. We know he has the stuff, we know he can go, but can he eat innings? Can he rely on himself to go 5 to 6 innings a game? So I think that's one of the biggest questions right now. I would imagine he potentially starts in AAA Iowa, but if he has a great season in spring training and a great debut, you could potentially see him at some point going off and making that opening day roster. But number 3 is a guy who may not be a favorite right now, but definitely somebody who I think we should be keeping an eye on, is Yency Almonte. We got him in the Michael Busch trade in early January, and I think he's one of those guys that, to me, you talk about what he's able to do. Year in and year out, he's pretty inconsistent. He's either one of the best relievers in the entire bullpen or is going to be one of the worst. If the Chicago Cubs could potentially channel that, this is a guy who's had sub-2 ERAs in multiple seasons for the Los Angeles Dodgers. I think they just haven't really been able to hone in on what he's great at consistently enough. I think, when you watch what he's been able to do over the last few years, I think he kind of changes his delivery and changes who he is every other year. If you can consistently get him into where he needs to be, I think that's really where I would like to see a guy like Yency potentially be one of the better relievers in this entire bullpen going into 2024. It's not talked about enough, and I think he's one of those guys that you could take a chance on, and I think that's exactly why they kept him on this roster. But with that being said, man, I think pitchers and catchers report is going to be a lot of fun. Yan Gomes, Moises Balestros, obviously Miguel Amaya, who made big strides in 2023. It's going to be fun to see what the catching position could potentially look like for the Cubs this year. Obviously, you have some big names, Justin Steele, Jameson Taillon, Kyle Hendricks and company, who are going to be returning for the Cubs. It's going to be fun, man. It's the only word I have, man. I know you're tired of hearing me say it. I'm sure I've said it like 10 times already, but this is going to be fun. We have an actual rotation that I believe is going to be able to win consistently. maybe not stay the healthiest, but we'll see what could potentially come of that. We got a lot of guys in the pipeline, the Cade Hortons of the world, the Jordan Wickses of the world, obviously Ben Browns, who could potentially step up if guys do go down. But let's get into it, man. Who are we most excited to see this year? Now, I've already seen Michael Bush taking plays at first base. I love that for him. I think the key word when you talk about a guy like Michael Bush is going to be continuity. I think you're going to be looking for him to be the most consistent he possibly can. And one of the biggest problems with that for the Los Angeles Dodgers was where you're going to put him, whether that's at first base, third base, or DH. From what I've seen so far, Craig Counsell has him at first base, and whether that's because CodyBellinger hasn't re-signed yet or because they don't trust him at third defensively, I really don't know. Or maybe they're saving that for Christopher Morel, James Triantos, BJ Murray. Who knows what they're going to do at third base? But that's going to be one of the biggest question marks, and that's going to be one of the more interesting positions for the Cubs in spring training this year. But as far as Michael Bush, offensively, he's been an absolute monster on all levels in the minor leagues. It's going to be really interesting to see what he could potentially do at the friendly confines if he cracks the opening day roster, which we expect him to do. His offense is going to be what keeps him in the lineup, without a doubt. Now, whether you're DHing him or putting him at first, I definitely think it's going to be very interesting to see where he is every single day. I hope it's not like a platoon role to where he's not playing consistently enough, but I don't get that vibe from Craig Counsell. He's already adamantly spoke about, Christopher Morel needing to play every single day, and Christopher Morel is one of those guys who in less than 110 games last year knocks in over 25 home runs. You give him 130, 150 games, this is a guy who hits over 35 to 40 home runs a year, and I think Craig Counsell understands that. So I don't think he would do too much to get rid of a guy like Michael Bush immediately. We already saw what happened with Matt Mervis with inconsistent play over Eric Hosmer and Trey Mancini. That didn't help his development. But you also still have guys like Matt Mervis on this roster who could potentially crack that first base roster spot. So we really don't know. It's going to be fun. But I think one of those guys I want to keep an eye out on, like we were talking about earlier, is Seiya Suzuki. Seiya Suzuki didn't get a chance to participate in spring training last year due to, I believe it was an oblique injury that he suffered in the World Baseball Classic. That second half of his season was absolutely monstrous, finishing the year with over 20 home runs pumped in. He's one of those guys that I think you could rely on to be potentially a 3-4 hole hitter if he continues to develop going into year 3. He's one of those guys that I think obviously is going to get the worser end of the stick when it comes to how we finish the season because of the drop against the Arizona Diamondbacks or it was the Atlanta Braves. I forget who it was. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. He's phenomenal defensively in right field. He just had one bad drop, and it's understandable. It happens. But that was definitely one of the pivotal points of his season, and I think he understands that. So he's going to go out there and he's going to ball out. So Seiya Suzuki is one of those guys I would love to see in spring training this year, just because we didn't really get to get a good glimpse of him last year. It was a slow start to the year for him because of that injury. It felt like he was always playing catch up until the All-Star game. Obviously, you get that little break, and he started to really come into his own. So I'm excited to see how he capitalizes on a strong second half last year. Seiya Suzuki is one of those guys I think you're going to look at and say he is going to be one of the top performers for the Chicago Cubs offensively this year, and maybe even all around. On top of that, Nico Horner, Dansby Swanson coming off of Gold Gloves in 2023. Your up the middle defense right there is absolutely phenomenal. Whether it's Cody Bellinger or Pete Crow Armstrong in center field, I think defensively we are going to be one of the better teams in baseball. I don't think that's a question mark. I think that is solidified. The Chicago Cubs team will have a Gold Glove at the end of the year. I think they're without a doubt one of the better defensive teams in all of baseball. I think they're showing it every single day. You have 2 Gold Glovers already in Ian Happ and Pete Crow Armstrong. You bring Cody Bellinger back into that fold, and you're looking at a guy like Dansby Swanson, Cody Bellinger, Pete Crow Armstrong, Ian Happ, Nico Horner, the list goes on. The Yan Gomes of the world. They're great defensively. So I think there's a lot of guys that you could potentially look at and say, these guys are going to be able to play the best defensive baseball in the game, especially when you have guys like Justin Steele and Kyle Hendricks, really just getting ground balls in, doing what they can to put guys in position to make plays. I think that's going to be the best thing for them. But it's going to be interesting. It really is. I was going to say it was going to be fun. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. There's so many different ways this offseason can go. It can go a plethora of different ways. And we see the comments. You know what I mean? We see the comments. Our final conversation today, is going to be about free agency. Obviously, the 4 big Scott Boras clients are still on the board: the Matt Chapmans, the Blake Snells, the Jordan Montgomerys, and of course, the comeback player of the year, Cody Bellinger. Will the Chicago Cubs bring back Cody? I think, It's almost certain that the Cubs bring back Cody Bellinger. That's really how it feels. We're at that point right now to where it's like, we don't hear anything from any other suitors. We don't hear anything from any other organizations. There were rumors about the Phillies or the Giants or the Blue Jays being interested, but nothing really caught traction with that. From what I understand, the Cubs are still the far favorite. It just comes down to numbers at the end of the day between Scott Boras and Jed Hoyer. But at some point, I know Cody Bellinger is going to want to get back out there, want to regroup with either a new organization and new teammates or with his old boys in Chicago. So with that being said, though, man, I appreciate you guys for tuning in. I appreciate you guys for listening. We'll keep you guys up to date on everything pitchers and catchers, everything spring training, everything Chicago Cubs baseball. Until then, this is the Shy Kid. Hit that follow button if you haven't already for everything Chicago Cubs content. Until then, peace.